we try so hard to not be too big. Don't be too big, right? Because if you're too big, we can cut you down, and we fucking will cut you down, is the essence in the Tall Poppy series. You're listening to the Everyday Legends podcast, the show that is dedicated to championing everyday men and supporting you in getting more from life, love, and the everyday. I'm your host, Mike Campbell, and the aim of this podcast is pretty simple: to support you in building rock-solid foundations, legendary integrity, and kick-ass relationships, with plenty of stories, a load of lessons, and a solid dose of some loving straight talk. So let's get started. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Everyday Legends podcast. Mini episode, shall I call it a mini episode? I'll call it a mic drop. This is going to be a punchy little solo episode where I want to talk about one thing. It's a topic that has come up a lot over the years within me, within my world, within my coaching, within my content. Now, there's one line that I'm going to take and then I'll expand upon a little bit. It doesn't mean as much to certain areas of the world. And it's this line here, the tall poppy syndrome. If you're in the US, you might never heard of this before. And one of the reasons I know that is because I've had to explain this idea to Americans many times. It's almost a foreign fucking concept to Americans to even grasp this. If you're in New Zealand, Australia, probably some other places, maybe Canada, certainly a lot of the time in Ireland and the UK as well. I think it has, my experiences, it has different manifestations, different ways of showing up in different parts of the world. So let me explain it in the simplest way possible. Tall poppy syndrome says that the tall poppy, the poppy that rises above the rest, the person that rises above the rest, puts their neck out above the others, will be cut back down to size. And so in essence, what it says is, don't get too big for your boots. Don't get too big. Don't outgrow everyone else, or we'll bring you the fuck back down to size. Never get too big for your boots. Always know your place and never kind of get too big. And so the reason I say that that's often a foreign concept for a lot of Americans is because I have actually had to explain that, not just tall poppy syndrome, what does it mean? When I say that piece, they're like, what do you fucking mean by that? Like, doesn't everyone want to succeed? Doesn't everyone want us? I'm like, don't do an American accent, Mike. Doesn't everyone want to succeed and become great and fucking all this stuff? And it's like, well, actually, yes and no. I've experienced the tall poppy syndrome and witnessed it and seen it. And that's what I say when I experience it. I've seen it in people, men, like, holy shit, and taken on board in Australia. And in New Zealand, my experiences, and I think a lot of people certainly who spent time in New Zealand and who are Kiwis will probably be able to connect to this very quickly. It's certainly if you've also spent time in Australia to have that kind of that relativity point. In New Zealand, it has like this whole different level. Not like it's bigger or it's badder or anything in New Zealand. It just has a different kind of level, the tall puppy syndrome, where it's like there's this version of humility that's kind of bred into, or that we've absorbed and fucking tried to take on board. It's like they put fluoride in the water and they put this like intensified level of tall poppy syndrome in the water when we grow up, in the curriculum, where it's like this version of humility that if you are not humble to the point of belittling yourself, self-deprecation, and like undervaluing yourself, then you're too big for your boots. And like, it's so easy to see everywhere, but you've only got to really look at New Zealand sports people. We almost expect our sports people to be the best, but do not fucking ever think that you're the best. Like, never acknowledge or celebrate your bestness, right? Your greatness. You need to, like, yeah, we really make humility out to be the virtue amongst all virtues, but what the humility is actually kind of self-humiliation. And I am here to say one fucking thing. Well, actually many things, but I'll start with this one thing right now. I mean, I've said a few things, so I'll transition to this point right now, and that is this. Humility is not self-humiliation. Humility is actually understanding your capability, owning it, honoring it, not belittling it, not overvaluing it or overinflating it either, but being okay with who you are, knowing that if you want to go beyond something and you don't have the tools, you know that you have some limitations, finding the tools, the support, the guidance, the limitations, but not just beating yourself up, undervaluing yourself, belittling yourself for the sake of avoiding some kind of judgment or attack from someone else or some other people. And that's really what tall poppy syndrome comes down to. And so what that tends to look like, and I see this in so many men, and this is why I wanted to bring this to this mini episode today, men listening, if this is you, then listen carefully, because at the other side of it, I'm going to present you with, I don't know, I haven't really thought about this, a challenge, an invitation, let's say. But what happens when we take on board, the tall poppy syndrome, where it becomes this kind of like fucking coat that I have to put on every day, right? Never be too big. Don't get too big for your boots. Keeping in mind, right, when we go out about life in this all or nothing approach to things, like, the nice guy thinks if I'm not a nice guy, I have to be a fucking asshole. It's like, no, fuck, what? That's the other end of the spectrum. Just don't be a goddamn walkover and only be nice so people like you and so that you can get some semblance of being a worthwhile person. Being an asshole is very, very different. You're allowed to be honest with compassion and respect and kindness, have boundaries, right? And so when it comes to this, if your only view is, well, if I'm not being humble and bringing myself down, then I'm bigging myself up and being an arrogant piece of shit. There's so much black or white in that. There's no room for humanity and nuance. You can celebrate yourself, acknowledge your positive traits, the shit that you do well, the shit that you're proud of, the shit you apply yourself to. Acknowledge that, celebrate that, honor that, without being completely self-centered, self-absorbed, self-indulgent, self-important, arrogant, overinflating yourself. There's a big, big difference in there. So what ends up happening for so many men, and again, this happens in different places in the world and might be called different things. And as I said, in New Zealand, it's got a particular flavor to it, which I abso-fucking-lutely adhered to, absorbed, took on board, was my Bible in a way, without consciously kind of bringing it into any sort of awareness until I did, was the embodiment of tall poppy syndrome is do not get too big for your boots, which massively flew in the face of kind of what I wanted on some soul level, which was like to excel and step into my potential as a rugby player. It meant striving to be my best, but that would have required me to quite be too big for my boots. So we try so hard to not be too big. Don't be too big, right? Because if you're too big, we can cut you down, and we fucking will cut you down as the essence in the tall poppy syndrome. But then at the very heart of humanity is not to be too small, because to be too small is to be insignificant, is to be inadequate, is to not be needed and wanted and have some value. And no human, despite their conditioning, wants that. Now, we might live a world where we fucking eventually, we might live in a reality where we continue to embody that because of what we've learned about ourselves and the shit that we've been through and trauma and all this kind of stuff. But no one deeply wants to be worthless. And so what happens is we find ourselves in this fucking gray zone. Don't be too big, but definitely don't be too small either. Don't be too big that you can be cut down, but don't be too small like that you're not important and valued. Like, we want to be seen and valued and appreciated and approved of and stuff, but not too big. So we end up trying to walk this like impossible tightrope of not being too big and not being too small. The fucking Goldilocks zone of, I am hesitant to use this word because it sounds extremely judgmental, and fuck, maybe that's what I'm doing in this whole podcast, but this impossible Goldilocks zone of mediocrity, of nothing, of gray nothingness. And I suspect that you might connect to that, and I don't mean to judge you. I've been in that place. I'm offering up a perspective to reflect on and go, have I taken on board this whole thing of don't be too big, but be big enough that you're not too small? And so what happens is I end up feeling like I exist in this gray zone where I don't value and honor myself but I do get others to try and honor and validate and approve of me so I feel enough-ish. And it just feels like it's not satisfying, it's not wholesome, it's not rewarding, it's not honoring myself, it's not respecting myself. And so here is the real point, not the real point, here's a point, you know what I'm talking about by now. In this episode, the Goldilocks zone of grey nothingness is not a place to create and live a rewarding, fulfilling, meaningful life. You will feel it. I guarantee you fucking feel it. If this is you and you've been it, if you've been in it, you will feel that. And the consequences will be throughout your life, including those people who you care about or potentially have the possibility and the potential to care about in the future, who might not be in your life right now. They will feel that and suffer those consequences too. No one benefits. No one meaningful in your life benefits from you playing in the Goldilocks zone of fucking nothing grayness. You get to honor and celebrate yourself. You get to humble yourself and be humbled by people who can keep you honest when you are maybe going beyond reason. Now you're overinflating yourself. Why? For ego, to feel secure because there is an insecurity plugging that, to feel powerful because of a lack of power within. We get to be humble and be humbled, but we get to honor, acknowledge, and celebrate ourselves, back ourselves, plug our strengths, and be who we can be. Because the Goldilocks zone will lead you to immense frustration. And that, gentlemen, is not the place to build and live a life. If this is resonating with you, if you want to do something about this, then reach out to me. Not only have I lived this and been through it, but I've supported so many men, hundreds of men, who have explored and lived and experienced and realized, fuck, that zone is no longer for me. That's what we get to do. And that's what we do in the Everyday Legends Academy. So if you actually want to do something about this, move beyond this zone, because guess what? You're not going to get out of there alone. You might have some realizations now like, fuck, I don't want that anymore. But the very nature of it means we probably don't have the tools to truly let go of it and go beyond it without still being in judgment and self-beat up mode and being fearful of what other people think of us and being in comparison. We need good men, honest, accountable, strong men around us. That's what we do in the work in the Everyday Legends Academy. So if you want to truly move beyond it, then reach out, let's talk, and let's move beyond it. Because guess what? You get to. You've been listening to the Everyday Legends podcast, the show that is dedicated to championing everyday men and supporting you in getting more from life, love, and the everyday. If this podcast has benefited you, if you enjoyed this, then my request, my invitation is to share this with a man that you think will also benefit from this and enjoy this. Remember, please, wherever you find your podcast, you like us, subscribe to us, click download first, leave us a review. All those things both make sure you get all the updates when they come in, and it supports us in getting this podcast in front of more everyday men that could use it. Until next time, I've been Mike Campbell. Remember to build that legendary integrity. And remember, everyday men, we thrive when we are championed, when we are supported, when we are appreciated and recognized for who we choose to be in the world. Here is my invitation to both show up and be that everyday legend, and to continue to champion